Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about the implications of non-locality, and since I'm not a physicist, I'm going to try and come at this from a somewhat different perspective than the usual. And I'm going to try and look at what can be inferred from the three branches of parapsychological research, as well as the results of a little remote viewing study. Now, the first thing, as a non-physicist, I asked myself is, what is non-locality? And what I found is there's lots of different definitions, which is sort of intriguing. Classical physics says it's a direct influence of one object on another separated from a distance that can't be explained by local mediators. So, in essence, it's a form of action at a distance. Now, the problem with this is it implies causality, and we don't know that that is the case. So, what's another definition? Quantum physics talks about it as the correlation of objects at a distance that can't be explained by, again, hidden local variables. Correlation is a key word. It means it's non-causative. One isn't causing the other to change. They both just change at the same time or make the same choices. Left slit, right slit, whatever. So it talks about entanglement, complementary pairs, like the particle wave. If you have questions, feel free to ask Dean Radin, who understands it much better than I do. I'm going to use this definition. Non-locality is a state without boundaries of space or time. And this allows us to acquire information on any topic from any time with virtually no extrinsic limits. And the word extrinsic is important here because the unconscious mind does control what you can or cannot access. And so you have a certain amount of intrinsic limit, but not necessarily extrinsic. Same with mind-matter interaction, with a little caveat. You can act on anything, anywhere, at any time, as long as it hasn't been previously established by observation. So it appears that consciousness plays a role of some kind. Now, one of the three branches of parapsychology is the survival of bodily death. And this is probably the least favorite of most parapsychologists. It's very controversial. I've done a fair bit of research that looked at near-death experiences, past life hypnotherapy regression, reincarnation research, mystic visions, channeling, you name it. Throw it all together, try and figure out where the common ground is. What do they all say that's the same? And one of the things that seems to be a consistent factor, and we're just going to assume that the afterlife exists here, is that it's an other-dimensional, non-local realm. The key here being non-local. So it's not only a place where spirits exist before incarnation and after the death of the bodies, it's also a way that we can try and look at non-locality and get some clues about it. One of the first things you'll notice is that almost everyone talks about it having multiple energetic layers or vibrational layers, which they sort of say interpenetrate. So they're all in the same place at the same time, because space and time don't exist, but they don't see each other necessarily. They're vibrating at different speeds. Kind of like a fan blade when it starts up. If it's going really fast, you can't see that there's a blade there. And to me, the implication of this is that non-locality does not mean homogeneity. Now, if we look at other characteristics of the afterlife, we'll see that like-minded beings tend to aggregate together, often forming communities. Hard to say whether this relates to vibration. Some sources say that's the case. I almost like to use the term realms of immediacy, even though time doesn't exist. Because in some ways, the non-local system can be divided into two different groups. There's that at which you're aware of at the moment, and there's that which you're not aware of at the moment. And whatever you're aware of at the moment is there right now. So this is suggesting to me that non-locality doesn't mean being overwhelmed by everything at once. Emotional closeness and interest can influence on what is more accessible or what is more sort of immediate to you. Another issue is one of boundaries. Some spirit guides will talk about creating walls of vibrating energy around the newly dead or around those who are emoting a lot of energy, emotion, especially if it's negative. Anger, fear, grief, doesn't matter what it is, if it's really strong, they don't want that energy and emotion to contaminate the afterlife. And so they can actually create boundaries or barriers to locality. And I've already put the two implications up there. One is that emotions or energy can influence the non-local realm, which means if we're in a non-local realm, we're influencing the world around us all the time. And the other is that locality can be created by consciousness. And I think that's the most important one. We have a choice in some ways. Now, in the afterlife, whatever is thought about instantly manifests, whether good or bad. This can be a problem. You don't necessarily want to think about an out-of-control rhino charging at you if it's going to instantly happen. So in order to give spirits a time to adjust to the afterlife, learn self-discipline of thought, what they talk about is they'll create a stable environment of a managed community where they hold reality stable, that it can't shift easily. And it gives time that people can adjust without having to worry about things instantly manifesting every time they have a random thought. And I'd like to put out to you, what if the physical plane is another managed community? Well, you might ask, why would they even bother to do this? Well, spiritual progress is said to be slower in the afterlife. It's easier to learn lessons in the physical plane. And my conjecture is that this is because we have boundaries here of space and time. So locality might allow spirits to make better choices, have better accomplish certain tasks, because there's an awareness of the I, thou, it. There's an awareness of the this happens and then you have this consequence, which you don't necessarily have in the afterlife. Also in the afterlife, time moves differently or does not exist at all, so I think the best way to think of time may be as locality. Let's switch gears from the extremely controversial to the slightly less controversial, which is ESP. One of the first things noted by Gertrude Schmeidler and others, anyone who's read the Psychic Threads, delightful book, is that ESP is more common where there's an emotional tie or emotional closeness. And why this is, we're not entirely sure. There's different possibilities. It could relate to the fact that connection being important to the unconscious mind, because clearly the unconscious mind controls what you can do, whether it's ESP or mind-matter interaction. On the other hand, it's also possible that locality is an illusion or an artificial construct of consciousness that's more easily breached when there's an emotional closeness or an altered state of consciousness. Now, rather than go through ESP and mind-matter interaction, also known as psychokinesis or the older term telekinesis, there are certain things that are true for all forms of psi. So I'm not going to bore you with repeating it twice. I'm just going to state them together. One thing that's very clear is that what a person can or cannot do, or remote view, is more a result of what matters to their unconscious mind than what they're capable of doing. And this is something I talk to psychics about all the time. They go, oh, I can do this, but I can't do that. It's like, well, that's just telling me what's important to your unconscious mind, not what you're really capable of. As their needs change, so will their abilities. Now, the implication of this is that we can affect the world around us in ways, noticed or not, that allow us to meet unconscious needs. And this is part of Jim Carpenter's new first sight theory that he talks about. I kind of agree with it. You certainly see it with poltergeist phenomena, where it's very clear that you're having mind-matter interaction that is meeting unconscious needs. The unconscious is driving the bus. I can't emphasize that one. We also have the experimenter effect, where experimenters working under the same conditions will get differing or conflicting results that conform to their desires or expectations. And again, this may involve experimenter psi, whether alone or with that of their participants. But to me, you have to ask, are we in unconscious collusion with others to create our reality and its limits, including locality and unidirectional time, so as to conform with our beliefs? Mind-matter interaction is really my specialty, my bread and butter. There are a number of things I can tell you from an exhaustive literature review. One is that energy isn't necessarily a factor unless your belief requires that it be a factor. Also, belief can alter and limit what is possible. Now, If you have a healer who feels cardboard will block their healing energy, cardboard will block their healing energy. If you have a healer who thinks it's irrelevant, it's irrelevant. So you have to understand the power of belief. And we're not talking about conscious belief, we're talking about unconscious belief, which unless you've done a lot of work on yourself, you're not likely to be aware of. Now, the implication to me of this is that non-locality may be one of the things that we're limiting ourselves with through belief. Also, you have to be aware that shared intention has a greater impact. When you have a group of people doing mind-matter interactions, it has more power usually than a single individual. Well, what if you have a whole consensus reality that's holding this paradigm of locality, and it's blocking researchers from being able to find findings of non-locality? It's an interesting idea. I think time is probably the most intriguing concept of our era, and it's going to be the one that I hope is sort of solved in my lifetime. I don't know if it will be. It's something I will be the first to admit I don't understand, but I'm very, very curious about. I think it's an interesting phenomena. We have the retro mind-matter interaction experiments that suggest time is bidirectional, if not multidirectional. With time slips, you have different time periods that can simultaneously coexist. And then you have the reports of mind-matter experiencers who talk about changes in the flow of time in terms of speed, whether it's speeding up, standing still, slowing down. Time's a big factor in a lot of reports. And so I'm asking these questions. I don't know the answer. It may well be all of them are correct. But are alterations in time a byproduct of the state of consciousness? That's what I thought 10 years ago when I wrote the PK zone. Is it the result of entering into a non-local dimension? A lot of psychics talk that they feel they open up and they actually enter another reality, and that's where they do their work or get their information, and then they come back to this reality. I don't know. Is it because locality is an illusion, and we just sort of let go of that illusion for a little bit? Is it a direct result of time being a target for mind-matter interaction? I think that's a definite. I really do. The more I study this, the more I think that we are directly affecting time when we're doing some of our mind-matter interaction. The unconscious will do whatever will get its needs met, whatever needs to accomplish a task. And then we have that other question. Is it because consciousness controls space-time? I suspect that may be true also. Oops, did I skip one? I guess not. Now, I do controlled remote viewing, and there are a number of people here who do that. One of the advantages of that technique, in my mind, is that it can use numbers to represent any type of target in existence or non-existence, including concepts. And I actually practice with the California Bay Area Remote Viewers Group that we humorously call ourselves Group 19 because we meet in room 19, nothing too fancy about that. And it's been run by VJ Ram for over 10 years and meets twice a month. And we're just there to practice and to learn and to keep our skills honed. Now, since we're used to working with all types of targets imaginable, including paraphysical ones, historical ones, and real photo targets, all kinds of things, concepts. I especially like the concept ones. I figured, why not task them with this topic? What are the implications of non-locality? And see what they come up with. And so that's what I did. Two of them, unfortunately, only 2 other people showed up that week. So there's only going to be 3 people in this, and I was clearly not blind. None were reimbursed. Sessions were really short. They only lasted about 45 minutes. So we didn't get in depth with this. I didn't give any front, mid, or end loading to the blind participants. I just wanted to see what they'd come up with. So all they knew is they had a text target. They had no idea what kind of target. Could be anything goes. The first remote viewer it's kind of nice. We sort of went the spectrum. Is a total beginner, really. He'd only been doing it about a year. He'd only had beginning class from Lynn Buchanan. And what he got was people, peace, life and death, may be seen as a disaster at first. I like that one. Dichotomies of everything, and has a historical perspective. And I like that one, but I still don't have a clue what it means. But it feels right. The second remote viewer was the most experienced, and that was Vijay. He's been doing this over 10 years. He's trained under a lot of different people, and he uses a wide range of techniques. He got a little bit more than the other guy. He got stable, traveling through a network of things that bubble up and give life. Again, network of things, giving purpose, giving life. Work is being done, but it's not troubling anyone. Nothing's there. Nobody's helping anybody. And stuff is happening, but nothing bad to anyone. It's all being done for good. Now, I was not blind, but I did this anyway because I really enjoy conceptual targets. I did actually bring my sheets with me that I worked from if anyone's curious to see what remote viewing data sheets look like, as well as my sheets for a different conceptual target I did, which I was blind to what the target was until afterwards. And that was the most important aspects of the Jonestown massacre. Somebody gave me that one. Delightful. One of the things I like to do that Vijay sort of came up with is using sand to create your model for your CRV target. And I really, really like it. As a kid, I just loved playing in the sandbox, and I think this just brings up great joy to my unconscious, because when I compare the results I get in the sandbox, if I do a timeline, and if I compare that with the results I get on paper, I'm always more accurate in the sand. My unconscious just adores it. And it makes sense that it would work well because it's what psychologists use for play therapy and also to find out what's on the unconscious minds of children. So it's a great way to get information. And as you can see from this, I got 4 major ideograms. This one, which I spent the most time with, it was the most interesting. This one, and this one. It has a confusing runaway aspect that's overwhelming. It's composed of dichotomies, so a little repeat of what viewer 1 got. That they're separate yet together, everywhere and nowhere. Everything's the same, unchanging, only our viewpoint changes. Determined by consciousness, which connects through time. When I'm getting concepts, I'll get sentences sometimes. That's just typical for me. Endless repetition of patterns we think are different, yet are the same. The differences are only superficial. Non-locality does not mean homogeneity. It has a living, organic quality, almost of breathing in and breathing out. It's not quite what we think. It's kind of a duh. We connect energetically to points of time and can shift around because of separateness. That to me was sort of interesting. So again, it's saying that there's an advantage to the separateness. The more consciousness participates in the non-local, the less it participates in the unique. And sometimes the future and past loop back to the present, the flow of time curling back on itself. And I will show you the drawing I did of this, because this is basically the sketch I did off of the green ideogram up here. And what I was getting was that returning to the past, it's memory or retrocognition, and then it loops back to the present again. And with this, it's precognition, déjà vu. You sort of dip into the future and loop back to the present. So to summarize, I'm trying to keep Roger where he doesn't have to work too hard today. The particle wave dichotomy may be the tip of the complementarity iceberg. Non-locality does not mean homogeneity. Areas of locality can exist within non-locality. I think that's an important one. You can have simultaneous locality and non-locality. Limits can be imposed by consciousness. There can be benefits to locality. And it's possible that by changing ourselves, we can, through entanglement, non-locality, affect every other particle connected to us. What we experience in life is at least partially a product of our own choices. I think it's important that we accept responsibility to make thoughtful choices and to practice mental self-discipline, which, by the way, the spirits say will help us in the afterlife because we'll have a head up on learning that mental self-control that we need. Research findings on non-locality may be influenced by experimenter participant beliefs as well as general cultural beliefs, because this is a co-created reality. So that means, can we trust our findings if they're saying we have locality? Not necessarily. I don't know. I think existence may be less rigid or fixed than we imagine. Shifting forms from the virtual back and forth to the real, almost like the breathing of a living organism. And that as a whole, the non-local is a fluid network that's stable. And the question might be, what could result if this is true? And this is all conjecture here. I'm first to admit I don't know for sure. I'm throwing out ideas. It's the fact that understanding that karma is simultaneous. What you do to someone else is instantly happening to you. You're not waiting for another lifetime. It's now, in the moment. I think if we took on that belief, we'd also take on increased spirituality because of a greater awareness of a broader perspective, a broader view. I think it could change our whole paradigm, which I think some might indeed see as a disaster. But I think it could also be empowering because it could say we can indeed change the world. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Pamela. It was the fastest 35 minutes I've ever seen. And I'd like to take advantage of having a microphone in my hand to ask if you would expand a little on the idea that you presented early in the talk, that we may be actually creating a consensus reality in which psi might exist or might not exist. Mm-hmm. I'm one of those who do the research in which we find that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so just generally and openly, could you expand on that idea?
There's tremendous amount of self-fulfilling prophecy in this business. And we're constantly dealing with the fact this is a co-created reality. You can talk to any psychic and they'll tell you there are certain people who can shut them down on a heartbeat. Anytime they're around them, they can't feel any energy, they can't connect, they can't get any ESP, they can't do mind-matter interaction. On the other hand, it's a whole business of whether you have a psi-conducive experimenter that Gertrude Schmeidler talked about. There are some people who can get the best out of their participants, and it's not necessarily them doing the psi themselves, although I'm not sure that there's any way to block that other than doing a good research design where you have one who's sort of skeptical and you have one who's a believer, like Marilyn Schlitz and Richard Weissman did. I'd love to see more studies like that. I think that's awesome. Only 2 of their 3 studies showed the experimenter effect, but Marilyn said that she was so tired by the end of the 3rd study that I think she wanted it to fail on some level. She's like, I just want to be done with this. I think that the problem that I see the most often is people don't understand the power of the unconscious mind. So I'll say again what I said before. The unconscious mind is driving the bus. And so unless you've done a lot of therapy or done a tremendous amount of work, one of the advantages of controlled remote viewing, why I do it, isn't to necessarily get better as a psychic or better as a remote viewer. It's to learn about myself, because you learn a tremendous amount by what you can or cannot connect to, and the unconscious mind will throw in all these side comments about how it feels about anything. My own personal pet peeve is I don't like people who refer to regular psychic stuff as controlled remote viewing. They are very different ways of working. But I just think it's really hard to know how your unconscious feels about things, whether it has this sort of sneaky wish to sabotage you or to succeed. it'll do whatever it takes to get those needs met. You know, poltergeist phenomena show that, really.
Okay, some more questions? And it would be best if you'd come up to the microphone. Maybe those people who have questions could come over here.
I hope that answered your question, Roger. I was actually thinking of your research a little bit with that sometimes you get a little locality with your non-locality. A little mix.
Thank you, doctor. I had a question. As an MD and an anesthesiologist, did you ever have the experience of a patient passing on flatlining and then coming back and having them tell you about it?
Nope.
Yeah, over 30 years, really?
Nope, never.
Okay, thank you.
No, and I was open to asking. I don't think it's that common. Or you know, but I was using my own intuition to know when they were going to do something nasty that I'd better start double checking everything really fast, and I did prevent disasters when I could. Yeah.
My question is about, I guess I'll call it conditioned space. William Tiller defined that as one of the variables. Has anybody ever tried to, that you know of, tried to get quantify aspects of conditioned space that support the phenomena?
I don't think I understand conditioned space well enough to answer that,
Okay, thank you.
to be honest. Yeah.
In your opinion, what exactly is it about emotion that makes it so influential?
It's power. I mean, if you talk about the unconscious driving the bus, emotion is sometimes the fuel, that puts it in gear. It is the lead thing that you see in spontaneous experiences. When you look at mind-matter experiences, they fall into two categories. One is the experienced person who does it by going into an altered state of consciousness, and it's often very unemotional, just making the changes. With spontaneous experiences, it's almost always peak emotion that triggers it, and it's a release of that emotion. So if people are trying to learn how to do mind-matter interaction, a lot of times the best way for them to do it is to think of a really emotional moment. Like if you're trying to bend a spoon. Jack Hawk used to say the most impressive spoons he ever saw bent were by a Vietnam vet who had been in a situation where they parachuted in, and his parachute had gotten caught in a tree, and the Viet Cong were there, and they had machine gunned everybody in his group, and he was the only one who survived, hanging from this tree, helpless. He thought of that moment, and the spoons just flopped over. I can see why.
Thank you.
Thank you. As an anesthesiologist, did you have any different kinds of interactions with people when their conscious minds are not in charge?
Yes. One of the things that the University of Arizona was looking at is the fact that there's two types of memory, implicit and explicit memory. And you can have, I saw this probably most dramatically with child victims of rape. And that even if they were totally unconscious under full general anesthesia, their body remembered being touched, and they would just go nuts. Sometimes the OB-GYN doc would have to examine them as part of the police procedure and stuff, and they couldn't do it. It was like a moving target, even under full general anesthesia. So clearly the unconscious mind remembers things unrelated to the conscious. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, hello, I'm Dale Graff. I work in both the remote viewing side and the dream side, and I find that when I'm doing experiments with people that are relatively new, if I ask them to recall dreams, whatever they might be, the dream itself will reveal some of the resistances, whether it's within themselves or within the environment that they might have come from. So I work then kind of in a semi-therapeutic mode to get over that impossible situation they might be in, and then move forward. So I'm wondering if in your work, spontaneously or otherwise, you have run into insights unanticipated from the dreams of yourself or the people you work with.
Ooh, I pay a lot of attention to my dreams. I'm a certified master hypnotherapist, among other things. So I do regular work with myself and try to really improve my communication with my unconscious mind. at all times and work on my issues. Even so, with controlled remote viewing, you'll still sometimes get surprises. You know, the unconscious mind will give you all this sort of commentary. And sometimes it's sort of, what Lynn Buchanan would call the P5, how you have symbols for certain things, and you start to learn how to translate what that symbol means to me. It's the same as how psychics will tell you, oh, I see this symbol. When I'm meditating, I know it means this. So you start to learn to translate the language that the unconscious is talking to you about. But you can do that work for years and years and still have some interesting surprises. It's an ongoing process, I think.
Speaking of surprises, since you've been suggesting that the world may be or the physical world may be a consensus created by our collective belief systems, how in such a view is it possible for anybody to get evidence that contradicts the consensus established belief system?
It's slow. I think that is part of it, and you can have groups of researchers who are very focused. I think focus translates to power when it comes to mind-matter interaction. The more focused you are, the more power you have when it comes to making shifts. The other thing you need to consider that maybe didn't come through in the talk is that we may not be the ones creating this consensus reality. It could be it's being done from the spirit realm, who know what's going on. And do they allow us to gradually make shifts, start to grow as our own method of spiritual growth? Maybe. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas. I want to get people thinking. Make those neurons synapse. Yeah.
I'm a neurologist, and I'd like to ask you a biological question.
All right.
Do you think that the frontal lobes of the brain might in fact be serving to inhibit the unconscious brain, and that the activity of the frontal lobes might be suppressing these abilities, remote viewing, creating an environment of locality? And then if you looked at people who had either frontal lobe damage or whose frontal lobes weren't working, that you might in fact get enhanced effects of the unconscious brain.
Yeah, I don't, for several reasons. One is you don't really see strong evidence of psi in animals who have more of the mammalian brain and lack the frontal cortex. You would think if all you need for that kind of consciousness is the hindbrain, that you should see more obvious psi in animals. We don't really. It's really pretty iffy whether any of that is anything other than experimenter effect. I actually talk, in my Mind Matter book, I actually have a section on the brain, and I look at the frontal lobes. One of the things that's interesting that's very consistent in every experience of mind-matter interaction is there's focused awareness, which is very definitely a right hemisphere, locus. So if you didn't have that ability to focus your awareness, can you do mind-matter interaction? I don't see evidence of that.
Yeah, we did a study in a patient with a huge left frontal lesion, but had an intact right frontal lesion, and actually replicated a psychokinetic effect using the random event generator from the Pear Lab. So the question is, although in animals you might not see it, could the human brain have evolved to the point that the rest of it, which is different from animals, might in fact be released when you suppress parts of the frontal lobe, not all of it, because you do need some of it.
Yeah. I always love those kind of studies. They're always interesting, but the problem is they're also always a very small number of subjects by definition, since we can't, go in and muck with people's brains, or it's unethical to, I would think. So then you don't know, is this experimenter effect? Were they the ones doing the psi, or were you? You don't know. And there are very interesting, one-sided, but I think for us to really understand the effect of the brain and the frontal cortex, the frontal lobes, we're going to have more fMRI studies. So I hope you can do them. I hope you have access.
Working on it.
Excellent. That's what we really need.
Really enjoyed your talk. I want to try again, though, on the conditioned space
Okay.
with a quick explanation.
Okay.
Bill Tiller said that when a group of people come together in the same place with
Right.
the same intent, you
Right.
know, harmonized
Right.
And so on, the space itself becomes conditioned in such a way that it actually amplifies, you know, and harmonizes what the intention is. And if they went to a different space, it just wouldn't be as strong. The effect wouldn't be as strong. And some of his experiments showed that there was an effect. It could be a church, or in his case, I think it was just a room of some sort where the group came together over and over again and focused and concentrated on the same thing. Any experience you might have with that?
The two things I'd say, one is it makes me think of the Linger effect, which is certainly seen by Jack Hawk and others, where if they do a PK party and you have pieces of metal sealed in glass, it'll continue to bend for 3 days after the party. So yeah, there may be a Linger effect. I think one of my favorite studies on group consciousness making an effect in the area was the meditators who meditated on, I guess, peace I think it was in the Bay Area, or California. And what they found was the crime rate went down. And then they stopped, the crime rate went back up. And so those sorts of things are interesting. It does suggest we can really influence the world around us, especially if we are working together with one focused intention. And Bob Monroe did a bunch of studies with that too, I think. Yeah.
Could you discuss, list, perhaps rank the factors that you feel limit our unconscious beliefs?
Limit our unconscious beliefs?
Or determine them?
Ooh, determine. Well, gosh, the problem is we don't understand what the unconscious mind is. I mean, we don't even understand the conscious mind that well. We can't prove it. We don't even know, is the unconscious mind actually the body? Some people suspect it is, the way it stores memories when you touch a spot in the body. I mean, and there's, you know, the question of, are we having thoughts before it's reflected in the brain? We don't know where consciousness is. We don't know where the unconscious is. Clearly, some of it is beliefs that are taken on very, very young. Now, whether that's happening intrautero, because it's very clear that babies do hear while they're still in the womb, whether it's beliefs that you take on as a young child, whether it's beliefs that you carry from the spirit realm, it may well be a mix of all of them. And I don't think we understand it. But I have a feeling my time's up. Yes.
Thank you very much, Pamela.